Good day everyone. Today in this video, we, the group 4, will discuss about behaviorism. My name is Marjaya Okulangkulan, a Bachelor of Secondary Education Science student, the first reporter. So, shall we begin? Behaviorism is an area of psychological study that focuses on observing and analyzing how controlled environmental changes affects behavior. The goal of behavioristic teaching methods is to manipulate the environment of the subject, whether it's a human or an animal, in an effort to change the subject's observable behavior. From the behaviorist perspective, learning is defined entirely by this change in the subject's observable behavior. The role of the subject in the learning process is to be acted upon the environment. The subject forms associations between stimuli and changes behavior based on those associations. The role of the teacher is to manipulate the environment in an effort to encourage the desired behavioral changes. The principles of behaviorism were not formed overnight, but evolved over time from the work of multiple psychologists. As psychologists' understanding of learning has evolved over time. Some principles of behaviorism has been discarded or replaced, while others continue to be accepted and practiced. A basic understanding of behaviorism can be gained by examining the history of four of the most influential psychologists who contributed in the behaviorism. These are Ivan Pavlov, Edward Thorndike, John B. Watson, and B. F. Skinner. These four did not each develop principles of behaviorism in isolation, but rather built upon each other's work. So I'm going to discuss about behaviorism by Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov is a sociologist and it is most well known for his work in conditioning dogs to salivate or drool at the sound of a tune after pairing food with the sound over time. During his studies on the digestive systems of dogs, Pavlov noted that the animals salivate naturally upon the representation of food. However, he also noted that the animals began to salivate whenever they saw the white lab coat of an experimental assistant. It was though this observation that Pavlov discovered was by associating the representation of food with a lab assistant, a conditioned response occurred. Here are some definition of terms to know. Number one is stimuli or stimulus. Something that exists in a surrounding or that is represented. Number two is the response. Means that how the animal responds to the stimulus. So the experiment that Pavlov did has referred to Pavlovian conditional or the theory of classical conditioning. This is how the experiment of Ivan Pavlov went. First, before the conditioning, the dog just drool or salivate when it smells food. The smell is the unconditioned stimulus, and the slobbering or the drool of the dog is the unconditioned or natural response. The ringing sound, which at the point means nothing to a dog, and it is the neutral stimulus, and it produces no drooling. During the conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus, the food smell, is paired with the neutral stimulus, which is the bell sound, and the result in drooling. This is repeated many times until the association between the two stimuli is made in a stage called acquisition. After conditioning phase, The old neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus because it now elicits the conditioned response of drooling. So now the dog will salivate in the presence of the bell sound and there is no presence of food. Pavlov's work with conditional reflexes was extremely influential in the field of behaviorism. His experiment demonstrate three major tenets of the field of behaviorism. Number one, behavior is learned from the environment. The dogs learn to salivate at the sound of the tune after their environment represented the tune along with food multiple times. Number two, behavior must be observable. Pavlov concluded that the learning was taking place because he observed the dog salivate in response of the sound of the tune to the sound of the tune. Number three, all behaviors are the product of the formalized stimulus response. The sound of the tune caused no response until it was associated with the representation of food, to which the dog naturally responds with increased saliva production. Classical conditioning, sometimes referred to as Pavlovian conditioning, uses a few different terms to help explain the learning process. So here are some classical conditioning examples. This can be helpful to look at a few examples of how the classical conditioning process operates on both experimental and the real-world settings. In reality, people do not respond exactly like Pavlov's dog. There are, however, numerous real-world applications for classical conditioning. For example, many dog trainers use classical conditioning techniques to help people train their pets. These techniques are also very useful for helping people cope with their phobias or anxiety problems. Therapists might, for example, repeatedly pair something that provokes anxiety with relaxation techniques in order to create an association. In education, teachers are able to apply classical conditioning in the class by creating a positive classroom environment to help the students overcome their fear and anxiety. Pairing an anxiety-provoking situation, such as performing in front of a group with pleasant surroundings that helps the student learn new association. Instead of feeling anxious and tense in this situation, the child will learn to stay relaxed and calm.
I'm Aljun P. Pusod, a PES Ed Science 1 student, and I will going to report about the behaviorism by Edward Thorndike. So, what is behaviorism? It is a theory of learning based on the idea that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning. Conditioning occurs through interaction with the environment, or it is a theory that human or animal psychology can be objectively studied through observable action, behaviors, rather than feelings and thoughts that cannot be observed. So, Edward Thorndike, he is an American psychologist regarded as a first to study operant conditioning. It involves learning from the consequences of our behavior. Thorndike began with testing the intelligence of animals through mazes and puzzle box. For puzzle box experiment, Thorndike used mostly cat. He placed the cat in the puzzle box with a scrap of fish placed right outside the box. Thorndike waits. How long would take the cat to escape? The cat tried different ways to escape and would eventually stumble upon the lever to open the cage. After escaping, he repeated his experiment. He put back the cat inside the box and timed how it took the cat to escape the second time, and the third time, and the fourth time exception. The cat would learn that pressing the lever had favorable consequences. and would adapt this behavior, becoming quicker and quicker at pressing the lever. And because of this, Edward Thorndike put forward to a law of effect, which state that any behavior that is followed by pleasant consequences is likely to be repeated, and any behavior followed by unpleasant consequences is likely to be stopped. And also, he determined that reward is for more effective than punishment. So, for example, if the student study for a test, they will get high score. And if the student does not study in the test, they will fail and will hopefully learn from their mistake and study next time. And how this theory applied in teaching. A teacher should use positive reward to encourage good behavior and good study skills from their children or student. Positive rewards come in all shapes and forms. It can be as small as a piece of candy, or it could be some points when they cooperate in class. And also, it is important to use repetition and teaching. And what is the importance of behaviorism? Behaviorism is the key for educator because it impacts how students react and behave in the classroom, and suggests that teacher can directly influence how the students behave. And that's all. Thank you.
And now I am going to discuss Behaviorism by John B. Watson. John B. Watson was a pioneering psychologist who played an important role in developing behaviorism. Watson believed that psychology should primarily be scientific, observable behavior. So, when we say behaviorism, focuses on the idea that all behaviors are learned through interactions with the environment. So, according to John B. Watson, behaviorism equates learning with behaviors that can be observed and measured. And also, reinforcement is a key to successful transfer through behavioristic learning. Strong emphasis on the stimulus, the response, and relationship between them. So, behaviorism was formally founded by John B. Watson in 1913. In 19th century, similar views as psychoanalytic and Gestalt movement in psychology. In 20th century, result of cognitive revolutions. And the last 21st century, behavior analysis is a thriving field. Behaviorism coined the term by John B. Watson and also studied how a certain stimuli lead organism to make responses. Believe psychology was only an objective observations of behavior. Also focuses on observable stimulus responses behaviors and consider that all behaviors are learned through events and situations within the environment. So, the Little Albert experiment was a famous psychology experiment conducted by behaviorist John B. Watson. Previously, Russian sociologist Ivan Pavlov had conducted an experiment demonstrating the conditioning process in dogs. Watson took Pavlov's research a step further by showing that emotional reactions could be classical conditioning in people. The Little Albert experiment was a controlled experiment showing empirical evidence of classical conditioning in humans. The study also provided an example of stimulus generalizations. After observing children in the field, Watson hypothesized that the peripheral response of children, the loud noises, is an innate and conditioned response. He wanted to test the notion that by the following the principle of the procedure now knowing as classical conditioning that normally would be not be feared by a child. Watson's focused not on the internal emotional and psychological conditions of people, but rather on their external and outward behaviors. He believed that a person's physical responses provide the only insight into internal actions. Example, when teachers reward their class or a certain student with party or special treat at an end of the week for good behavior throughout the week. So, the core of Watson's work is best known of taking his theory of behaviorism and applying it to the child development. He believed strongly that a child environment is the factor that shape behaviors over their genetic makeup or natural temperament. Watson's is focused for saying the cold, take a dozen healthy infants and train any of them to become any type of specialist he might select. A doctor, a lawyer, artist, merchant, chef, and yes, even a beggar man and a thief. In other words, he believed that you can expose the child to a certain environment, process, and, over time, condition the child to become any type of person you want. As you might imagine, this was radical thinking and a type of behavioral control that many people were not comfortable with at the time. So, that's all, and thank you.
Skinner's story of behaviorism. Verhulst Friedrich Skinner, famously known as V.F. Skinner, was a leading American psychologist, Harvard professor, and proponent of the Skinner explains the difference between informal educations, which depends on the teaching of creating optimum patterns of stimulus and response, that reward and punishment. This model of behaviorist learning journey is famously known as operant conditioning of it be of it. Through operant conditioning behavior, which is reinforced, that is rewarded, likely repeated, while behavior which is punished occurs less frequently. It is important to remember that by the 1920s, John D. Watson had left academic psychology and other behaviors will becoming influential, proposing new forms of learning other than classical conditioning. One of the most important of these was Skinner's model of behaviorist learning theory. Look at the causes and its consequences. Again, he called this approach as operant conditioning. At the core of Skinner's operant conditioning is the view that the behavior that is followed by pleasant consequences is likely to be repeated, while behavior followed by an unpleasant consequences is less likely to be repeated. It must be noted that, however, that this view was based beyond on Thorndike law of effect. Skinner introduced to the new term to do the law of effect, that is, reinforcement. So that for Skinner, a behavior which is reinforced tends to be repeated, that is strengthened, while behavior which is not reinforced tends to die out or be extinguished, that is weakened. Skinner studied operant conditioning by conducting experiments using animals, which he placed in a Skinner box, which was similar to Thorndike's puzzle box. A Skinner box, also known as operant conditioning chamber, is a device used to object reward animal behavior in a compressed time frame. An animal can be rewarded or punished for engaging in certain behavior. Through his experiment, Skinner was able to identify three types of responses or operant that can follow behavior. Namely, first, neutral offense, that is, responses from the environment that neither increase nor decrease the probability of the behavior being repeated. Second, reinforces, that is, responses from the environment that neither increase nor decrease the probability of a behavior being repeated. Reinforcement can be either positive or negative. Punishes, that is, responses from the environment that decrease the likelihood of a behavior being repeated. Punishment weakens the behavior. According to Skinner, we can, therefore, of the examples how our own behavior has affected by reinforced and punishers. As a child probably tried out a number of behavior and learned from their consequences. For example, if you were younger, you tried smoking at school, and the chief consequences was that you got in the crowd you always wanted to hang out with. You would have been positively reinforced, that is, rewarded, and would be likely to repeat the behavior. If, however, the main consequences was that you were caught, caned, suspended from school, and your parents became involved, you would most certainly have been punished, and you would consequently be much less likely to smoke now. In positive reinforcement, according to Skinner, a response of behavior is strengthened by reward, leading to the repetition of desired behavior. The reward is the reinforcing stimulus. Skinner showed how positive reinforcement worked by placing a hungry rat in her Skinner box. The box contained the lever on the side, and as the rat moves about the box, it would accidentally knock the lever. Immediately, did so a food failure would drop into a container next to the lever. The rat then quickly learned go to straight to the lever after a few times of being put in the box. The consequences of receiving the food if they pressed the first lever ensured that they would repeat the action again and again. As we can see, positive reinforcement strengthens a behavior but providing the consequences an individual finds rewarding. For example, if your teacher gives you chocolate each time you complete your homework, that is a reward. You'll be more likely to repeat this behavior in the future, thus strengthening the behavior of completing your homework. On negative reinforcement, for Skinner, negative reinforcement is determination of unpleasant state following a response. This is known as negative reinforcement because it is the removal of an adverse stimulus which is rewarding to the animal or person. Negative reinforcement strengthens the behavior because it stops or removes some unpleasant experience. For example, if you do not complete your homework, you give your teacher chocolate. Hence, you will complete your homework to losing your chocolate, thus strengthening the behavior of completing your homework. Skinner shows how negative reinforcement work by placing a rat, a rat in her Skinner box, and then subjecting it to an unpleasant electric current, which causes it some discomfort. As the rat moved around the box, it would accidentally knock the lever. Immediately did so, the electric current would be switched off. The rat quickly learned to go straight to the lever after a few times of being thwarted in the box. The consequences of escaping the electric car ensured that they would repeat the action again and again. In fact, Skinner even taught the rat to avoid the electric current, but turning on the light just before the electrode came on. The rat soon learned to press the lever when the lights came on because they knew that this would stop the electric current being switched on. These two learning responses are known as, as escape learning and avoidance learning. Punishment. Skinner defines punishment as the opposite of reinforcement, since it is designed to weaken or eliminate a response rather than increase it. It's an aversive event that increases the behavior that it follows, like reinforcement. Punishment can work either by directly applying an unpleasant stimulus like a shock after a response, or by removing a potentially rewarding stimulus. For instance, deducting someone's pocket money to punish undesirable behavior. Implication of operant conditioning in education. In the conventional learning situation, operant conditioning applies largely issues of class and student management, rather than to learning content. It is very relevant to shaping skills performance. A simple way to shape behavior is to provide feedback on learner performance. For example, compliments, approval, encouragement, and affirmation. Variable ratio produces the highest response rate for students learning a new task, whereby initial reinforcement, for example praise, occurs at the frequent intervals as the performance improves. Reinforcement occurs less frequently, until eventually only exceptional outcomes are reinforced. For example, if a teacher wanted to encourage students to answer questions in class, she should praise them for every attempt regardless of whether their answer is correct. The teacher will only praise the students when the answer is correct. Over time, only exceptional answers will be praised. Lastly, unwanted behaviors, such as tiredness and dominating class distractions, can be extinguished through being ignored by the teacher rather than being reinforced by having attention prone to them. This is not an easy task, as the teacher may appear insincere if she thinks too much about the way to behave.